Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am very excited, as I said at the end of the last episode, to bring you a second interview this week, a second interview with an author who has just written historical fiction. This is historical fiction that is actually based on a true story of his family, so it's kind of historical fiction / memoir. It is written as a novel, but it is based on a true story. The book is called Heart of Steel. It is by Kevin D. Miller. And the description, well, it's fascinating because how much do we really know about our family's history? My mom has done a ton of genealogy work. She's been fascinated for many years now and has traced our family back to all kinds of interesting things and places and events. But how much do we really know about the people in our family? My grandparents told us stories, but I know we were only getting parts of those stories. And that is really where this story starts, is finding out that your family history isn't exactly what you thought it might be. So the description of Heart of Steel is this. In the early morning of September 13th, 1920, in Southington, Ohio, 12-year-old Stanley runs for his life along a dusty country road. His mother frantically set him to fetch the sheriff. Fearing for the safety of his family, he pushes himself onward to reach help. An infamous scandal unfolds over the next several weeks, taking Stanley and his siblings on a harrowing journey through a notorious orphanage and an incredible attempt to escape. He will later meet his soulmate, an Irish woman who will put him on a path to healing and help him finally come to terms with the torment of a family tragedy. The story is based on true events in the life of Stanley William Miller. It inspires the heart on how a young man's devotion to his family pushes him beyond impossible odds and testifies to the perseverance of the human spirit. A broken spirit can only find healing and redemption through true love and real forgiveness. So this is, as I said, fascinating in that you never quite fully know your family's true story. It depends on your family and how they communicate, and different generations and different cultures, different family types communicate differently. In this case, his grown son, Kevin's father, did not know this story of what happened in his own father's childhood. They learned that their last name of Miller is not actually their last name, that their grandfather changed it. And so it's this very interesting story of discovery, but also discovery for the younger generations, but also that we get the story of Stanley. And it starts in 1920, as the description says, and then you get some interesting pieces of Prohibition history as Stanley grows older and is, he's a rum runner for part of the book. There's some descriptions of speakeasies. And one thing I found fascinating was that this does take place in Ohio. Parts of it are in Canton, which is very close to where my husband grew up, and we were just there this past summer. So if you go to Kevin's website, there are some videos, and there's one video where he goes to Warren, Ohio, which is where my husband has family. And so just watching that video was fascinating for me because I was like, yep, that's Ohio. That is that area where my husband grew up. So it was kind of fun to experience that area through this story, and just kind of fun for me personally. But let's go ahead and turn now to the interview with Kevin Miller. I keep trying to call him Kevin Steele because of the name of the book. Sorry about that, Kevin. Kevin D. Miller is the author of this book. The book is Heart of Steel. I do have copies to give away, so stay tuned until the end of the episode to find out how you can enter the giveaway. And let's now turn to the conversation with Kevin. Hi, Kevin. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you for being here. I am excited to talk about your book. It's called Heart of Steel. Before we get to that, though, if you could share a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Actually, I'm a U.S. veteran. I spent 8 years in the Air Force. I was born in Canton, Ohio, and actually grew up in Tempe, Arizona. We moved out there when I was about 6 years old. Currently living in Burbank with my 2 daughters who are acting in Hollywood, so we're kind of supporting their acting careers. And my wife and I, between the two of us, we have like 9 children and I believe 21 grandkids. I'm losing count. But so
wow.
Pretty big family there. Yeah.
Do you have a spreadsheet so you can keep track of their birthdays?
I need a spreadsheet, Sarah. I totally need a spreadsheet. I can't keep it all in my head. Now my wife can. Annette, she's got it down, so I just kind of depend on her. She's my spreadsheet.
That's amazing. So speaking of family, the book is actually based on a true story from your family. Can you give an overview of Heart of Steel?
Yes, I can. The story is actually a true story. Kind of a surprise that we came across this story, actually, because we did not know this, the events of this. But the overview of the book itself is a story about 12-year-old Stanley William Miller, who was my grandfather. And in 1920, in rural Ohio, the Southington, which is a township outside of Warren, a terrible murder takes place. My great-grandfather, George Puhalski, was murdered in his sleep. My great-grandmother, Stella, was tied to a chair, and she claimed that 3 men came in, bound her and gagged her, murdered my great-grandfather, stole $600 cash, and made away with it. Well, my grandfather, who was 12 at the time, was sent to fetch the sheriff to investigate the murder and everything that went on. And so this is kind of where I found the story, because I came across these old newspaper articles from 1920, and it kind of chronicles the investigation and how this goes along. And it took some bizarre turns and twists that were kind of unexpected. So that's kind of where the story begins. Later on, Stanley and his siblings, they find themselves in a notorious orphanage in 1920. And so he works to try to escape that and save his family and raise his family. And then the last part of the story is actually a love story where he finally meets my grandmother, my Irish grandma, and he finds his happiness, and she helps him resolve the issues of his life that he had to struggle through as a young boy with this. He actually ran away to Chicago, hopped a train, and found work in there in a steel mill. And he also got involved in bootlegging. So the idea was to save enough money to go back and attempt to rescue his siblings out of that orphanage.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. So how much of the story did you know going into reading those articles and doing the research?
It came as a total surprise, Sarah. My dad, who's 87 years old, he's still around. He's going to be 87 years old this month in March, actually. He didn't know this, but our name, we didn't know our name really wasn't Miller, that it's actually Puhalski. And the way we found this out was just around 1999, actually, is when these newspaper articles kind of popped up. We had some cousins that were doing some family research for fun, and they came across them, and they sent those to us, said, you might want to read these because your name's really not Miller. And so we just started kind of reading through these articles, and we're just, stunned, by the revelation. So they kind of sat there for a few years, and then we just really started kind of putting all this stuff together and doing the research, several years later. A few years back, my father had been communicating with his cousin, and they'd kind of gone back and forth and exchanged information. And she sent him some good documents, some really valuable documents that helped me with writing the book. He wanted to write the book originally, but he just felt he couldn't do it, and he asked me to do it, and he just kind of handed everything over to me. So I took those documents, and there was gold in there because there was descriptions of the farm, there was legal documents, there was court documents, and that allowed me to do even further research and to kind of pulling all this story together and all the facts around it together to build the story. But we were totally in the dark with this.
We are going to go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. As we go to that break, I can't help but thinking that, even though my mother has done a ton of research into our family history, I would not necessarily be terribly surprised if there wasn't some crazy story from my grandparents' past, because neither set of my grandparents would have talked about anything like this. So we wouldn't have known. I mean, they would have just pretended it never happened, and we would never have heard anything about it. So we're going to go ahead and take that break, and when we come back, we'll be talking more with Kevin D. Miller about Heart of Steel. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, Kevin was talking about finding out that his last name is not his last name. Well, it is, but that had been changed, and that there was this very big event that led to many, many more events in his family's past. So let's go ahead and get back to that interview.
It's amazing how people of that generation, of your grandparents' generation, tended to keep a lot of that stuff just buried. You don't talk about it.
Exactly.
And so the fact that you found out, and I'm assuming that by the time you found out, your grandparents had both died?
Yes. When we found out in 1999, my grandfather passed away in 1985, 86 of cancer. So he took that to his grave. I mean, on his deathbed, it's in the book that my uncle actually asked him, it's like, tell me about your life, Pops. And he just like, don't ever ask me about my life. And he took it to his grave. He never talked about it. His siblings never talked about it. There was clues, now that we look back and my father looks back, he's thinking, you know what, your grandfather told me this once, and now it makes sense what he was saying, so we kind of piece those things together. But he was very tight-lipped, and him and his siblings, really kept a tight hold on that scandal.
Wow. So as you talked to family members, cousins, did they have any little pieces that everybody kind of started saying, "Oh, I guess this all makes a little more sense" as the picture started becoming clearer?
Yeah, there was a lot of that, and actually, my dad had a beautiful letter from his cousin Frances, who's the daughter of Sophie in the book, the oldest daughter, and it was just full of good information that she kind of learned just through her mom. I mean, just little bits and pieces and stuff, and she kind of shared that with my dad. They both kind of shared information with each other as to what they knew. So to kind of paint that picture, to kind of write from. So yeah, that letter was good. And then, yeah, just kind of talking to everybody, just kind of reaching out and seeing who might know something, who might, have another piece of the puzzle. So that kind of helped. But there's some gaps in there. There's some stuff that we're just never really going to know.
Mm-hmm. And so is that the reason that you decided to write it as historical fiction, so you could kind of fill in those gaps for the story?
Yeah, exactly. So, because my father, he was originally wanting to write this like a documentary, and when he handed it to me, I just said, Dad, I said, I want to turn this into a novel. I want to turn this into a historical fiction based on a true story, and I'm going to fill in the gaps to kind of pull the story together, and the stuff that I know, and kind of the stuff that I think I know, I kind of put myself in my grandfather's, mind, and yeah, I just kind of filled it in because I wanted to kind of read like a novel. It's a true story, a good 85% of it is real events, and the other parts are just parts that I'm making assumptions, and I'm just, as a author, just being creative and pulling it all together to tell a good story.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about your grandfather, Stanley. He is the main character. What about him do you think is going to resonate with readers of the book?
I'll tell you, I think what's going to resonate, and what seems to resonate, listening to the wonderful feedback that I get all the time from readers, I think it's his heart. I mean, the book title is appropriate. His undying love for his family, and his struggles to overcome tremendous adversity and finally find that peace and forgiveness in his life. I think they're going to resonate with his journey, because I think, most of the readers seem to just live this story through his eyes and feel his pain. They cry, they laugh, they just kind of live the story through him. And I think what really resonates is his courage as a 12, 13-year-old boy to step up and take care of his family and do what needs to be done, and to just overcoming all of this adversity and this horrible tragedy. I just have a whole new respect, for my grandfather.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is an amazing story.
Thank you.
I was thinking about my own family, and obviously there could be something, since you didn't know, but I really doubt there's something this major in my own family. But
You'd
just to find that
sure.
out. Yeah, well,
yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more about writing it as a novel, how you talk about the process of fictionalizing this family story, deciding how to fill in those gaps?
Absolutely. Yeah. What I did is I just first sat down and I just started writing. I just wanted to write what I knew. I began, the first part of the book is really, really close to the truth, because I had all those newspaper articles, which were gold, that told me the investigators, what happened what day. So that right there was easy, the easiest part to write, because I had so many facts to work with. So I built that and put that together. And then the part where they find themselves in an orphanage, I know some information there, but not all. So I did a lot of research on orphanages in 1920 to kind of get a feel for the sort of things that were happening. And I tell you, it was a sobering experience to come across all the tragic incidences of abuse and stuff that I found in a lot of these orphanages. And so I kind of put that together with thinking, well, why would my grandfather run away? Well, if orphanages are like the history that I'm reading and the research I'm doing, I totally understand why he wanted to get out of there and get his family out of there. So that part of it, I have to start to kind of fix on, because I don't know. It's 1920, so I don't know all the peoples and characters that would have run the orphanage. I know there was Catholic nuns. I know something about it, but so I have to kind of create those situations and those characters at that point to get you through part two of the story. And then the third part of the story with my grandmother, I knew a lot of the stories. My dad was a great resource, because he could talk to me about my grandma and my grandpa and stuff they did growing up. And plus, I knew my grandfather real well. and my siblings did. So I could just piece all those things together and create their story. Because I'm like, Dad, it's like, you know what, they weren't always old. They were in the 1920s were like the 60s, you know, it was a rebellious, crazy time, and they're two young adults, 18, 19 years old. So, and we knew that they, you know, that my grandfather did own a bar. And many of the incidences in their story is true, but like I said, I just have to kind of fill those in and just kind of fictionalize some things just to kind of fill the gaps and just keep the story flowing. So that was kind of the process. I would go back, and I think I re-edited and rewrote so many times. It took me about 3 years to write the book.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine that there was a lot of research in terms of filling in those gaps. Like you said, you know, researching orphanages, researching prohibition, those sorts of things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, speakeasies, prohibition, gangsters, that whole area, because Canton, Ohio, that's shady town of Canton, they referred to as Little Chicago because of you know that. Well, I'm sure your husband being from that area, and even Al Capone was rumored to have been, you know, hiding out there from the feds at one point and stuff. So there's a lot of stuff there, and there's a lot of good stories about the local mobsters and stuff. And I know my grandfather knew many of those. He was never a mobster himself, because my dad used to say that he would say, you don't ever, I do work for them, I don't ever do them a favor. You don't ever want to be in their debt, you know, but they would give him jobs, you know, to lay floors and do various things and stuff. They thought they really liked him, but he made sure that they never did him any favors.
I think that was a very wise choice on Stanley's part. And actually, I mentioned that we were in Ohio over the summer visiting my husband's family, and I remember him saying something about that area being known as Little Chicago. And before he said that, he had mentioned something about the mob and its history there. And I kind of snickered a little bit because, you know, here's this sort of quiet, quaint little town. And I was like, yeah, right. And he was like, no, really. And he took me to a place where they had supposedly actually Al Capone, possibly himself, or at least members of his gang, would that even be correct, planned some major something or other at this building, and it's now a pizza place. But I learned to not snigger at my husband when he talked about the mob in the area of his hometown. So let's go ahead and take our second break of the podcast. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Before the break, I was talking about not believing my husband, and Kevin was talking about his grandfather being a rum runner and dealing with members of the mob during Prohibition and all of that sort of fascinating history. So let's go ahead and get back to the interview with Kevin.
Through the process of writing this, because you knew your grandfather in a certain way. He was older. You were, you know, I assume a child or a young adult. How was it? How was it getting this new perspective on your father, really or your grandfather, really as a person? Because we don't always see our grandparents as people. They're our grandparents, right? They're just old and they love us and whatever.
Right. They're old and they've always been old, right? Yeah.
Right. Right. So
it gave me a deeper insight to him into his life. This was really an emotional story for me as well, personally. There was times writing this story that I'd kind of have to take a break because I'd get choked up and I'd become emotional in the scene that I was writing, because some of the scenes are pretty emotional. But it just made me love him deeper. I mean, he was a tough guy. I saw my grandpa. I grew up. He loved us, and I loved him dearly. He was a tough guy, and I always knew he was tough. I mean, he really did pull his tooth. There's an incident in the book where he does that. He would do it and complain. When he had cancer, I never knew, because he wouldn't complain the last time I saw him. But just reading this, I just see the depth of him that I didn't really realize as a kid. And you always want to go back and, oh man, if I could just talk to him now as a grown man and someone who understands him at a deeper level, that would be such a blessing. But
yeah, I can only imagine the journey that you went through in this writing process. What does your dad think of the book?
My dad loves the book. He was so thrilled and thanked me for writing it and for kind of telling the world about his dad. That meant a lot to him, and it meant a lot to me, because I wanted to hand him an autographed copy of the book when it was printed, and I got to do that, and that was a nice moment for me. And he just tells everybody that'll listen. He goes down to the senior home, and he's got them all ordering books, and he's telling everybody a story. He's very, very excited about it and really involved with it, and always paying attention to any interviews that I have or anything that comes out about the story. So he's a huge fan.
He sounds like he's very good PR for the book.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, he's great PR, because he talks to everybody, and he'll, even if you don't want to hear it, he's going to just tell you all about it.
I love it. So you came to writing in kind of a different way than some people often do. Had you ever thought about writing a novel before, or writing a book in general, or did this just kind of fall in your lap and went from there?
Yeah, kind of all of the above, Sarah. I'm a professional web developer by trade, and in that profession, I do a lot of technical writing. But technical writing doesn't really translate into writing a novel. So it was a learning experience for me, one that I'm so happy I took that journey. It's very difficult. I mean, I have so much respect and appreciation for authors and their gifts of writing and such, and I just I read several books and different ideas, and I just kind of fell into, my style is I just start writing the story. Because I believe that a good storytelling kind of overrides the rules, as they call them. They have their rules of writing, and I think if you tell a good story, most readers don't really care about whether you broke this rule or that rule. They just want to hear a good story, and they'll forgive some of those things if you keep them engaged in your story. And that's the kind of the approach that I took. So I tell the story in kind of I kind of jump in and out of first and third person a little bit. It's through Stanley's eyes. It's kind of a deep point of view where you're actually living the story as him, and then there's times where I'll narrate a little bit to kind of give you some background as to what's going on with the story.
Yeah. And has this inspired you to write more novels? Are you working on anything now?
Yes, actually, I've just started my second novel. I'm about 3 chapters in, and I have my wonderful critique partner, my wife, who probably reads 50 books a week. She's such an avid reader. She reads way more than I do, and I had her read the first 3 chapters of my second book, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, I love this. I was so sad that it ended at 3 chapters. I want to know what happens next." So okay, good. Because that's a relief. If I have her approval, I know I'm good, because she's really, really good at knowing a good story and good writing and stuff. So I kind of lean on her for that. She gave me a lot of really good insight and good ideas as I was writing Heart of Steel, different things I hadn't thought of and such. So yeah, I'm so excited to start my next book. I'm also working on getting the audio book for Heart of Steel. And the great news is Heart of Steel's been optioned for a movie here in Hollywood. So we're going to turn this into a film here in a couple of years. It's a kind of a process that usually takes a couple of years to get it from book to screenplay to film. So that's in the works as well.
Right. Oh, that's exciting. I hope it all comes to fruition. I would love to see this as a movie. Are you going to narrate the audiobook or someone else?
Yeah, that's what I'm working on, because I'm doing a lot of the narration myself, because I'm thinking it might be interesting to have the author narrate the story, but I'm kind of bouncing that around. So I'm doing some sample chapters to listen, to do myself, to see, what I think of that and what other folks think of that. And if I feel it's just too much for me to handle, I'll just find a voice actor who can do it for me. I even thought about, I have some friends who's a good friend whose son is a voice actor, and I even thought about approaching him and saying it would be kind of cool for a teenage boy to maybe narrate this. So I'm bouncing those ideas around. Yeah, I thought that would kind of be cool. So I'm not. So once I make that decision, then I'll just push forward and try to get the audiobook out. I'm hoping to get it out by September, because this September 13th of 2020 is the 100-year anniversary of the murder of my great-grandfather, where the story begins. Wow. Yeah, so good opportunity there. Mm-hmm.
Right.
For some PR.
Out of your personal experience in coming to writing this novel, would you have advice for aspiring authors?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think my best advice to any aspiring author is don't just talk about writing your story. Just sit down and start, because you have to sit down and just get behind the keyboard and start typing or start writing, however it is that you choose to write. Don't keep saying you're going to do it. Just sit down and do it and start gathering, the facts. I mean, it's going to take you some time and stuff, but every day, you just kind of decide, okay, I'm going to write this many words today or this many chapters today. And that's really what I kind of discipline myself to do. So that would be my advice. Don't talk about it anymore. Sit down and do it. Start it. Get it going.
In some ways, it sounds so simple, right? Just don't talk. Just do it. Just stop talking about it and do it. And yeah, you'd think that would be kind of a logical jumping off place, but there's so many different things that I know can hold us back when we think about starting a new project, especially something as personal as writing can be. So let's go ahead and take our last break of the podcast, and when we come back, we'll have the conclusion of this interview with Kevin D. Miller. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with Kevin D. Miller, author of Heart of Steel.
You mentioned that your wife is an avid reader. She and my mom would get along. My mom reads a book a day sometimes. How about you? When you take the time to read, what do you enjoy reading, genres or authors?
I do love historical fiction. I mean, I love stories like, Fried Green Tomatoes and The Notebook, Nicholas Sparks. I love the story of Braveheart by Randall Wallace. I thought that was an awesome tribute to his relative. So I kind of lean towards those historical fictional type of stories. I love those. Although I do read science fiction now and then too. I like a lot of different genres in that regard, or adventure. Sometimes I'll pick up an old Conan book, and you read it just for fun. But I think I gravitate towards the historical fiction. kind of stories. I love history, and I love how those are written, and I just love the idea of of the history that you learn from that story, even if the story is fictional. It just makes it interesting.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I'm always interested in what younger people are reading. Your daughters, are they reading anything interesting at the moment that they've mentioned?
They haven't. I mean, my daughter Gracie just finished the Diary of Anne Frank for school, so we were reading through that. Sometimes I'd sit and read it to her, because she's like got so much school. Dad, can you read a couple chapters to me? So she just finished that, and that was interesting. That was her school also went to a museum, about the Holocaust and stuff. So she was really affected, that really, had an impact on her emotionally. So that's her last read. And of course my book, because they have to read my book because I've got roles in the movie for both of them. Because they're both SAG-AFTRA actresses, they're professional actresses, and so yeah, I mean Gracie is the right age to play her great aunt Sophie, and Emily is the right age to play her great grandmother Emma May.
That's really cool. I love that. And do you read with your grandchildren? See, I'm so nosy about what people are reading.
Oh no, I don't take that job, because Annette does it. That's kind of her wheelhouse there, because she's such a good reader and she's so animated. I even thought about having her narrate the audio book too, because she's so animated. And she's got these great voices. But no, that's kind of her job. I don't want to step into her territory, so I let her do that.
Nice. Okay, I'll stop being nosy about what everyone in your family is reading.
Be nosy as nosy as you want to be, because we're all nosy. That's how we are. We're all always in each other's business, We got something going on, everyone gets on the horn, and, hey, guess what happened? Hey, so-and-so did this.
Have your wife call me so we can compare book lists.
Oh, yeah. No. Yeah, you guys could have a nice long conversation, no doubt.
Absolutely. In terms of your internet presence, do you have a website, and where can people find you on social media if they want to interact?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the best way to find me on social media is actually to go to the website, because, again, I'm a professional web developer, so I created my own website. But the website is heartofsteelbook.com. Steel as in S-T-E-E-L. So heartofsteelbook.com gives you a whole more background, and there's pictures up there, and there's video, and there's a whole bunch more information to kind of add to the story. So if you've read the book, it would be interesting to kind of go to the website and get more information. I have social media links at the top right hand of the page. I'm on Facebook. There's a Heart of Steel book on Facebook. There's a Heart of Steel book on Instagram. Also on Twitter. For some reason, my Twitter handle is Heart of Steel BO number 1. I don't know how that happened, but it just happened that way. I don't know why that makes me
laugh, but it does.
Yeah, I don't know. I was like, what the heck happened? How did that happen? But it's too late now, so it's there. And then I have a YouTube channel as well under Kevin D. Miller, and I post videos up there sometimes. But the videos are on the website too, heartofsteelbook.com, and I have my email up there, and I love to hear from folks who read the book, whether it's positive or negative, and really it's all been very positive. I'm so humbled and thrilled by that the reviews have just been amazing. And most people say it's a book, I can't put it down. I get messages all the time, I could not put this down. I read it in one night. The last lady I sent it to in Texas, she goes, I read this in one night. I was at 3:30 in the morning. It's 3:30 Monday morning, and I haven't slept. As soon as I compose myself, I'm going to write you a nice review on Amazon. So I'm like, oh, thank you. So I love hearing that stuff. But even questions, I have people contact me sometimes that might hear me on the radio somewhere that's, okay, what did your grandfather do after this? And so, but I love hearing from people. So I invite any of your listeners who read the book or who have questions to email me and ask me. I'll respond. I love it.
Yeah, and actually on the website there are there's some family pictures, but you mentioned in the acknowledgments of the book that your nephews did some of the pictures, like for the cover of the book.
Yeah,
that sounds like a lot of fun.
Oh my gosh, yes, sir. Actually, it's my grandchildren. The little boy that's kind of portraying Stanley on the front cover of the book, sitting on the railroad tracks. That's my grandson, Joel Miller. And the photographer who took the picture that I used to create the cover is Caleb Roten, and he's studying photography, and he's a wonderful young photographer. So I paid both of them. I paid Joel to be the model and Caleb to be the photographer to help me create the book cover. So they were awesome. So that's kind of a little trivia tidbit there, and I just I thought that was awesome.
I love that. You guys are like the you're a very talented family. I'll just put it that way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
So, Kevin, we've talked about the book. We've talked about writing. But is there anything that you really wanted to bring up that we haven't mentioned in terms of the book, or just anything that we haven't covered?
I think we had a great conversation, Sarah. I feel like we talked about everything. I got to say everything I really wanted to say. Just look for the movie. We're going to work on that, and I hope to get that released in the next few years. And other than that, I love the conversation, and I appreciate you inviting me on, and it was great.
It was really fun talking to you, and the book is fascinating, and I love historical fiction anyway, but the personal element really makes it even more compelling. So thank you for writing the story.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you once again to Kevin for joining me and for writing his family's story. I mean, I think it's really important to not only know your family's history, but also this is a really fascinating historical fiction, and it reads, you can just picture it kind of being a movie. So I really enjoyed the story. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. As I mentioned at the beginning, I do have copies of Heart of Steel to give away. So in order to enter that giveaway, all you have to do is go to our GSMC Book Review Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram pages. Find this episode, which is episode 218, of course, interview with Kevin D. Miller. And, please do like and share and do all of those lovely things. But in order to win a copy of this book, you need to comment on that post. And please comment by telling me, you don't have to tell me a whole a story from your family's history, but, tell me an interesting fact maybe about your family. I do have one story that has always intrigued me I have lots of stories about my family that have intrigued me, but my grandparents met at a dance in Montana, and my maternal grandparents, and the next day, my grandmother always says she was washing her hair, and she had her shirt off. She was just standing in her undergarment, washing her hair, and there was a knock on the door, and she thought it was the neighbor kid, and so she said, "Come in," and it was my grandfather, whom she had met the night before. Obviously, he was not my grandfather. Well, yeah, he was however that works in wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. So it was Harry, and Sylvia said, "Come in," and my grandfather walked in, and there she was in her bra washing her hair. And we always would say, "Well, so then what happened?" And no one would ever tell, she or my grandfather would never tell what happened after that part of the story. But as fascinating as that is, I also want to know, why were you letting the neighbor kid, I think she said neighbor boy, in if you were washing your hair in your bra? We'll never know, because they would never tell, and unfortunately now they're both gone. But that's one of my favorite stories from my family's repertoire of stories. So anyway, if you want to win a copy of Heart of Steel, just go to our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter page, and tell me something interesting about your family. Also, speaking of social media, if you would be so kind as to follow us, like us, retweet, share, do all of those lovely things, but also subscribe to this podcast so that you always get new episodes, and give us a nice review, either written or 5-star would be lovely, lovely, lovely. Thank you again, as always, for joining me. Please join me again on Tuesday when I will have a recurring author. This will be my first guest to return 3 times, I think, I'll have to double check that, but I'm pretty sure I'm correct on that. So we'll be talking to Jason Pellegrini about his new novella, If I Could Have Lived Another Day. So join me for that. In the meantime, have a wonderful weekend. Take plenty of time to get lost in a good book. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.